to all of you. I'm happy you're here at this session with Shawn Donnelly. Shawn, welcome. I just wrote, as an introduction, a couple of facts down on my sheet about this war. I read that, I think it was yesterday, the UNHCR reported the sad number of 4 million refugees from Ukraine. There's more than $500 billion of war damage in Ukraine. Try to imagine the number. And yesterday, the UN Food Program Director said this is going to be the worst food crisis since the Second World War. So that's also one of those sinister facts, numbers associated with this war in Ukraine. Behind these chilly numbers, there's of course an immensity of human suffering, not only in Ukraine, but also in Russia and other parts of the world. To get some grip, if possible, on this terrible situation, we invited Shawn Donnelly, and you're willing to answer our questions and your questions. Shawn Donnelly, you're Assistant Professor for Technology, Resilience and Europe at the University of Twente, and he is specialized in international political economy with expertise in financial stability, crisis response and resilience. And in case you might wonder why Shawn's English is so fluently, he's Canadian by origin. Next to me is Jelle Posthuma. You're a reporter at You Today, the university newspaper. You already interviewed Shawn a couple of times about Ukraine, and that's why we're doing this together. And I'm Peter Timmerman from Studium Generale. Jelle,
I wanted to start today with the news of the day, news of the week. Today, of course, there was a speech from the Ukrainian President Zelensky addressing the Dutch Parliament. But the news of the week is, I think, the ongoing negotiations and the Russian military withdrawals, or rather regrouping of the Russian troops. Maybe the focus on the eastern part of Ukraine. And I was thinking, in your view, what should we think of these recent developments? Are we getting closer to a ceasefire, or what direction is this war moving, in your opinion?
We're not moving towards a ceasefire. This is, when two sides negotiate, they're exhausted, and neither side is. Russia is big. It's moving military equipment and personnel from the Far East to reinforce what they have. So you put this in perspective. Their initial force that they put together was 200,000 personnel plus physical material, and their total armed forces has about 900,000. So this is one portion of what Russia has to offer. And also note that the war has been limited to Ukraine. It hasn't been extended into Russia. That's on purpose, right? And the issues about what kinds of weapons we send to Ukraine, whether we put in a no-fly zone or not, are deliberately designed, and it's tough for everybody because, of course, it's horrifying what's going on. And it's understandable that they want more, and they probably should get it, but the decision is that if they do that, then it will involve strikes deep into Russian territory, and the NATO alliance is not ready to do that yet, because that is when the nuclear weapons come out, right? And that's not speculation. That would be something where that would be seen as a direct attack on the Russian state, and where they would punch much harder than they've been doing so. So talks, no. And the Ukrainians, they're doing a brilliant job with what they have. And why would they talk peace now before they're finished degrading the Russian forces? Why would they do that? But what Russia is doing is clearly pivoting, right? It's taking forces out of the places where it's doing extremely poorly and trying to double down on the places where they're doing well, right? And that's what any military officer would do. If your forces are if you've got forces that are doing well or holding their place or falling back and retreating, you don't double down on the places where it's retreating. You double down on the places that are doing well so that you can take more territory and crush the opposition. That's where we are at the moment.
So that's also what we can expect from the coming weeks, so to say? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
By the way, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. We come to you with mic, and so please interfere our discussion with Shawn. It's a Q&A for everyone.
Yes, please.
Shawn, another very important topic regarding this whole crisis is the sanctions of the West. Could you say something, how much impact or damage is this doing, and what are the risks of these sanctions? But first the impact. How effective is it? Is it already possible to say something about it?
Well, first we can say that economic sanctions in general tend to take a long time to work.
Yes.
The advantage that we have is that Russia's economy is fairly non-diversified, let's put it that way. And that means that it's less complex to devise sanctions that work. I mean, basically what you're trying to do with sanctions are cripple the economy and the industrial capacity, the war-fighting capacity of the country that you're targeting. And we're doing that reasonably effectively, but there is one big elephant in the room, which is that not all EU countries have fully made the transition in their minds and public policy to buying Russian gas. Just Germany alone is paying Russia 3.5 billion euros. And guess where that money is being spent? The Green Party is the one beacon of light within Germany right now, and I'm grateful that they're there. Because the Christian Democrats, the Free Democrats, the Social Democrats have all shown, we don't have to guess about this, they're all on the public record and saying, we are not going to stop buying Russian gas. Or we're going to do it little by little by little. And they haven't really thought through, they haven't thought through it. The financial sanctions against Russia, which prevent anyone from paying for things like gas, effectively, we've sanctioned the main banks. We've sanctioned the Russian central bank, which means that the state can't really finance itself, that imports and exports can't be financed properly. So this is going to have a bigger and bigger effect as time goes on. One of the bizarre things, though, is that because other imports can't be paid for, Russia is getting richer and richer right now, right? It's not importing stuff like it used to. They don't have a real industrial economy the way that we would expect this. So they have to import things, and now they can't import them, but they're still exporting stuff and running up that tab for us that we're supposed to pay for, that he now wants to be paid in rubles. So right now, it's not like the lights are out. We have to expect this to be a medium to long-term effect. One additional thing about the sanctions is that it's still in process. The demand from Putin that anyone who buys gas pay for it in rubles is, it's directly targeted, the Germans in particular, but all of Europe, to break the sanctions on payments from the Russian central bank. So it's still a work in progress. It's really nice to see that the economic ministry in Germany is realizing the reality and making a plan for when the gas stops. Because that should have happened a long time ago. We can sort of understand it's a coalition government and things move slowly. And I find it really bizarre that under those circumstances that the German chancellor was not on board with, we have financial sanctions, that means can't pay, means you can't get gas, and therefore, well, we might as well make the change now anyway. Wasn't him. Now it's the economics minister and the finance minister in the hands of the Green Party who are moving forward. So this is really, you know, It's a painful transformative process. But that means, to come back to the original question about the sanctions, is that they were getting better and better at putting together all the pieces of the puzzle. That will make it work over the long term. Right?
Should we have a plan like Germany as well in the Netherlands, or?
I'm sorry.
A plan like when the gas stops from Russia, should we have a plan?
Everybody has to have a plan.
Yeah.
If you buy if you buy gas from Russia, you're financing this. And we've been doing that despite the fact that they invaded Ukraine in 2014. They took Crimea. They took parts of Donetsk and Luhansk.
Yep.
And we kept financing it. 35 billion euros a year.
But why is
And
that, Shawn? It's 8 years ago, and it was easy to see Russia is taking the whole Crimea. But why didn't anything happen then? Why saving budget for an army or something like that? Nothing happened.
Okay, there are different parts about saving budget for an army. I'm just going to put a pin in that.
Yeah, okay.
But why is the EU doing it? And I'll go back to why are individual member states not doing it? So individual member states, they're different. So the Netherlands doesn't import nearly as much gas and rely on imports for its energy as much as Germany does. Germany is extremely dependent, but that's a deliberate choice of Angela Merkel. She rewarded Russia for its invasion with this Nord Stream 1 pipeline. And it's great that the Germans say, well, Nord Stream 2 won't go online, but what really counts is taking Nord Stream 1 offline, because that was the welcome card. Why is it not happening? You just need to look at the recent statements of German government officials, but you can see that in Italy as well, which is very dependent on Russian gas, that faced with the question of dropping the imports or not, they've said, it's the economy, the economy, the economy, the economy. And when this first came up after the invasion, it was the German the German finance minister, who's from the Liberal Democrats. This is a small, liberal market-oriented economy. And this party has deep, widespread ties to Russian import-export finance, all of that kind of stuff. And it was completely unsurprising to me that the finance minister said, absolutely not, we're not going to do it because it would trash the economy. What surprised me a little bit was that the chancellor from the Social Democrats then said just a couple days ago, absolutely not. It would wreak havoc with the economy. This is insane. Yeah, it's going to be painful. That is without doubt. But it isn't anything as painful as what Ukraine is going through. And effectively, if you don't do anything about it, you're financing it. I mean, they're complaining about unemployment going up a couple points. They're complaining about inflation going up a bit, but still under 10%. I mean, my God, what is the bar that they're setting for themselves? So you saw within all of the traditional political parties in Germany that the dependence on Russian gas was strong, that the values and priorities of those parties was focused on, jobs and having your house warm and your beer cold, and let's not take this out of the equation too. Older people, like who's voting for the Green Party? Much more younger people, people who don't have access to adequate housing. Not enough job opportunities, who are looking at this system that's been built up that isn't working for them, so why should they support it anyway? And they've been voting for the Green Party for ages. And now the Green Party is a critical mass and is in a position to do these kinds of things. And that is, for me, deeply encouraging because it means that there is a solid political base with a critical political mass within Germany at the center of German politics that has really changed the narrative. Once the others have been cornered enough that they don't see a way that they can continue the way that they're doing. Unfortunately, what it took was the real prospect that they wouldn't be the ones telling Russia that they wouldn't be buying the gas. It would be Russia telling them that they couldn't have it anymore because they wouldn't buy in rubles.
That was the wake-up call, so to say.
Sorry, the wake-up.
The wake-up call.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes you read that Putin might close the gas tap, but he won't do that. That's
he might.
But, and then what happens? Then we have no
Chaos.
gas.
And he loves chaos.
But you think he might do that because it would be financial
Yeah.
suicide for him? But you think it's likely?
If you're at war, what's the benefit of
Yeah.
trading with your enemy? This is
Okay.
wrong.
Uh-huh.
And that is true for both of us. And like it or not, we're at war. This is a proxy war. So you have, by a proxy war, we mean that each side is pushing weapons and support staff into a third country. Russia is by all, you got Russia on the one side, fighting in Ukraine. That's something that isn't so much proxy. But on the other side, it is a proxy war. We're not officially in there as NATO. We're not officially fighting as the EU. There's, European army. I know this question came up. We still got a pin in that. That's not going to happen for a long time, and largely because France took its one golden opportunity and shoved a knife in it by being too weak.
What was the golden opportunity then?
So France has had this idea for a long time about strategic autonomy and a European defense capacity. And it has this project called the European Intervention Initiative. And it's a good idea in principle, but they missed one portion, which was to accept an aggressive stance towards Russia. And this was why they could never get countries like Poland and Romania and Hungary on board, because Poland, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia also, they're concerned about Russia, right? They're former satellite states of the Soviet Empire and the Russian Empire, and they're afraid. This is why they're in NATO. And this is why, if there's any question, any wavering on the part of France, that no, this is not a viable alternative. And they don't want to send any wrong signals to Washington, D.C., whether the support is guaranteed under Biden or whether it's questionable, like it was under Trump, to defend them if they're attacked. They're very afraid about that. So what Macron did was play domestic politics. The French public was very happy with what he did. So I'm not going to call him a butcher. There's a discussion about that. I'm not going to try and do anything but try to appeal to Putin as a responsible great power, to find an off-ramp, as some of the doves would say, and not be hawkish, not work on deterrence and saying, okay, if you want to come in and threaten, we're going to threaten consequences back. He didn't do that. And that was his golden opportunity. He could have pivoted. He could have said, part of a grand strategy is not only diplomacy, but also deterrence. And because he isn't willing to go there, he can't get the critical mass for a European army that's way off in the distance. That's probably pushed off decades if anything happens. So I think that Europe will definitely build up its military capacity, but it's going to be within NATO. Right? Unless we get another president in the White House in 2025, who really breaks with NATO. But he would have to really break with NATO. I think unless we get that NATO will be the main game in town. And you can see everybody is now buying F-35s, and that supports the drone systems that go with it, so that the interoperability for Western forces in a broader European war are guaranteed. And this is absolutely essential right now, because we don't have time. If Putin makes good on his claim to go after not only convoys within Ukraine, but to go after the support stations within NATO territory, not with the army. I mean, we've seen what the army can do. Not very much. But if he starts hitting things and say, okay, I'm going to go for a push into Ukraine. To do that, I need to prevent the West from really reinforcing, then I'm going to hit stations in Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania. That is a minor version of what he would do. The major version is much worse. Then we'd be fighting. We'd be all out fighting. And for that, we need to have all sorts of distributed capabilities. And that's why everybody is rushing to buy American equipment right now, because they're really, that is a good sign that they're really scared and that they really need to provide the deterrence, the promise that if you do this, that will at the very least deny you your gains, right? Without even trying to strike back into Russian territory. But they would. I mean, F-35s were built specifically not only to be stealthy, but to carry nuclear weapons. The F-22, people have seen that run around. That was the original stealth fighter plane, still is, still the best stealth fighter plane out there. It can't take a B-61 nuclear warhead. And if Russia were to strike into our territory, we'd need to at least show that we have the capability to strike back. That's how deterrence works. And so you see them rushing to buy equipment that can open the possibility to this happening, to be difficult to eliminate, so that if he were to strike, we would have something left over to strike back. So I think that's all I can say about that right now.
Okay, and one question about the role of NATO. NATO is not involved officially in this conflict, but all NATO countries are pumping a lot of weapons and money into Ukraine. That's some kind of schizoid situation, isn't it? How long can this stay?
It can stay for quite a long time.
Yes, you think that's possible?
It's quite a long time. If you look at Afghanistan, if you look at Syria, if you look at Vietnam, these are wars that went on for a decade or more.
Okay.
And they could again. There's one golden rule about interaction between nuclear powers, major nuclear powers, not somebody like North Korea. It's that you don't fight each other directly. And even if you end up doing it by mistake, you create some sort of plausible deniability so that it doesn't, you can contain it and put a lid on it. So this is why when Zelensky was asking for no-fly zones, that the Americans were very hesitant, terughoudend, in doing that, because setting up a no-fly zone means that you have to shoot down Russian planes with American planes. And they weren't prepared to do that. Beside the point, the strategy that we have with Ukraine is the same one that we devised with Poland and the Baltics, and we're executing it now. So it was always what we call a porcupine strategy. Porcupine strategy, you know, you got the idea of a porcupine, an animal bites it and it gets hurt and then it has to go away. And the idea was that you could use a lot of guerrilla warfare, the type of precision rocketry that we've been supplying to the Ukrainian army, to decimate the forces until they bleed out so much that they go back home. We developed that and employed that in the between 1979 and 1989 in Afghanistan. That's where we developed it and we rolled it out. Only, well, the only side effect that we got was that we got the Taliban out of that and Al-Qaeda. So, you know, everything has consequences somewhere down the line, but here the consequences are clear. This is a European state. It is the victim of a horrible attack, which is now being waged on the civilian population. So there's not only indiscriminate shelling, but there's deliberate attacks of medical facilities, schools, shelters, just pounding Mariupol. The first reports of, old stuff that we were fearing about the Russian army, which are, you know, systematic gang rapes and all that kind of stuff. This is how the Russian army has fought in the past, and it's not a surprise that they're fighting this way now. None of this, I mean, all of this is outrageous. So what we're doing is what we can without taking the chance that at this moment, at least, and I want to stress that at this moment, that the Russians are tempted to strike. And it could be, I've talked about Poland, Hungary, or Romania trying to go into the near NATO territory, but if they were to decide, well, that's not going to work, we're just going to go for it all, then what they'll try to do is cut off the United States from Europe, which means they'll go and take out the internet cables, they'll take out all of the ports, so Rotterdam, goodbye, right? Hamburg, Antwerp, all of that will be shut off so that the NATO strategy has always been that we can't survive alone, that we need reinforcements from the United States, material, personnel, industrial capacity, and what the folks who are here to do is hold on long enough to ensure that we still have, the United States still has a bridgehead to reinforce us. If that is guaranteed, then it is difficult to lose a war. Now, I'm talking about it as if we're not talking about a nuclear war, but still, that's still baked into the way that the deterrence works. So I think for the next, so where are we going with this? I think that we're likely to see a porcupine strategy continue to work for quite some time. I don't think that either side is very likely to give up and go home and sign a peace agreement until one side is exhausted or the other. I don't see that happening in the near future, and it could go a long time. And in the meantime, what NATO will do is that they will massively ramp up what they have here. And that may have some very far-reaching consequences for a whole slew of things. But we'll have a return to issues that we had in the 1980s. Like, we basically got rid of all of our tactical nuclear weapons in the last 20 years. These are the small yield things, the Russians did not. And if we know that the use of tactical nuclear weapons are baked into Russian military doctrine, only when you escalate to a certain serious point. But again, because of the way that deterrence works, you need to have a working plan for how you would respond. What types of tools would you use? And that means in the 1980s, what we had was a very specific focus on very short-range and intermediate-range delivery mechanisms for nuclear weapons and tactical battlefield weapons as well. And we're likely to return to that unless we get a quick resolution and a peace settlement. But again, add one more thing. Given the fact that Russia has attacked and that it's annexed, try to imagine a situation in which you would recommend to them and they would accept such an argument. Let's say, just for argument's sake, that Germany goes insane and it attacks the Netherlands again, and we have a nice, successful porcupine strategy with our American friends, and somebody is saying that we should sue for peace and think about giving some territory where they hold Twente, Groningen, and Friesland, and Limburg. Because,
whatever, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
No, we would probably say no, I think, and nobody should expect them to do anything else. I'm going to stop there.
Yeah.
The crowd, maybe.
Yeah.
Please.
If you have any questions, please raise your hand.
Okay, thank you. So if NATO was to get involved, I was wondering if there are any rules for how you get involved, because Biden was talking about this regime change with the, well, they didn't like that at the White House, but are you going to fight a battle with your army on the ground and make it all very long-lasting, etc., or is it sort of allowed to actually try to go after Putin and his friends?
I mean, there are two parts of it, but I think it's really about the last one, right? effectively what Biden is calling for is for somebody in Russia to replace him. And that raises the question about how likely is that? Why do we think it would happen? Now, folks who are talking about financial sanctions were hoping, some of them, that that would lead the country to reassess its costs, and if Putin wouldn't do it himself, that somebody else would do it for him, right? But whenever you're talking about the replacement of the president, then you have to ask yourself where that replacement comes from. And Russia has very particular circumstances. So for me as an analyst, when I look at Russia, I only see one place where a replacement could come from, and that's from the KGB, something like that. If you were to illustrate why that is, to be a little nerdy, I would say that you look towards the institutions of the state where people come from that could take over. And alternatively, you look to some alternative power base. Those would be oligarchs. Well, the oligarchs have all been brought under control, right? The army is not going to produce anybody, likely. Well, they might. I mean, it could happen. But there's no political party like the Communist Party of China, where if, let's say that President Xi slipped and fell in the bathtub this morning, there would be somebody to replace him, and there would be a Communist Party to arrange that, and all of the internal power struggles would happen there, and they would be regulated. This is not so in Russia. So if it isn't the oligarchs, and it isn't a political party system, and army less likely, it would be what? Somebody who has a firm institutional foundation where there are colleagues who will support him or her, who knows. But it's Russia, so probably him. And, well, that's true for a lot of countries. You know, patriarchy and all that kind of stuff. But it would be someone who sees the world very likely in the same ways that he does. Russia is a great nation, but has fallen on hard times and needs to rebuild itself. And so yeah, I think that the call and the moral outrage is natural, and it needs to be seen in that light for somebody please internally get rid of this guy. Does that sufficiently respond to your question? Okay, great.
Thank you. Thank you for the thinking exercise that you are doing here. So it's really interesting. I would like to go back about what you said before answering the question from the audience. And you said that when the NATO will ramp up in here, it will have long-term consequences. And I would like to poke around about, a bit around this idea. What kind of consequences you see?
I think that you're likely to see much more, you're going to see more military bases. Some of them will be known to the public, some of them will be less known to the public. There will be a movement of more nuclear weaponry into Europe, and to a considerable degree. And there will be much more investment in what we call combat clouds, so drone warfare. It's possible, and this debate will probably be a little different from country to country, conscription, national service, and that can take place in different ways. In some cases, it's very straightforward, but if you look to the countries that have introduced it so far, more often than not, it's that people are expected to have military service for a year, year and a half, or alternatively be trained in things that are also super important for national security, such as being trained as a doctor, as a nurse. And you could, if we're smart, as individual countries and as the West, then we'll think about the other things that are quid pro quos for what we're asking of people, and how to spread the burden, right? If you talk about military or health service, That's for a particular part of the population, right? That can be spread out. You could think of the Swiss model, right? Where effectively you have this service duty until you're 55, part of the year. But we would also have to think about how to pay for all of this. And older, richer people will probably have to face bigger taxes, in order to help pay for it. That's unavoidable, I think. Or we borrow a lot of money, but then it becomes the young people's problem again, which is difficult. I think that's a debate that'll come. So overall, I think that we'll see a greater militarization of the economy. Everybody's thinking about, so just to sum up, militarization of the economy, probably more military or related service. And by the way, some countries are making this equal across men and women, so that, first of all, you have a choice of what you do, but that it's fairly equal in terms of application. Those are all going to be national discussions. They always were. They probably always will be. I think that it will, if that happens, then you will also have to think as countries about how you reward and compensate people for that. And there are lots of different ways. One is, I'm thinking back to the United States, is even if you're not looking at conscription and you want to get volunteers to come up, is to say, if you put in 3 years in the military, we will pay for all of your post-secondary education, free. Housing, tuition, books, you name it. This is done in the United States, mostly for the Officers Training Corps. But it's done, and there's no reason why you can't do it for everybody, as long as you make the commitment. Yeah, so I think that's about it.
And the first signal might already be the 100 billion investment of Germany into their
that's a nice start.
Military capacity.
Yeah, it's a nice start.
Yeah.
And then and then the numbers have to, that's the initial investment, right?
Yeah.
And then he's committed to 2% per year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Maart?
Okay, so the conclusion could be then that the Western countries are back from holiday, you could say. We have to go again to work. What is the role of the scientific institutions in this? What could be the role?
What is the role of scientific institutions? So I would say not so much back to work, but that peace dividend is over. It was nice while it lasted. And so what can we offer? There are, scientists are good, I think, especially when they're applied to practical questions, about thinking through the different options that we have. And also, and I can't stress this enough, is that there is a trap when you're faced with a military challenge to overdo it, to put too many resources into, and that's the caveat of what I was just talking about. You really need to think hard about where you spend your money, because one of Russia's problems is that it funnels so much of its public resources into the military. And it did that throughout the 70s and throughout much of the history of the Soviet Union. But one of the reasons,
what's their percentage?
I don't know. I don't know the percentage, but I've only got one figure for you that comes from a meeting from when I was back in Canada, and we had a briefing from Defense, and I didn't cross-check this myself at all. But he said this was 89. So this was just before the wall fell. Mm-hmm. He said, look, here's our briefing. We think that the confrontation with the Soviet Union, as it was back then, is still ongoing, but that the question was, is the opening for peace real? Glasnost, perestroika, that type of thing. And I know I'm mispronouncing it. And the assessment, and this was important for us, was yes, it is real. Why? Because life expectancy in the Soviet Union had been dropping and dropping and dropping because investment in healthcare had been declining and declining and declining. If you put all of your effort into military force, you rob your people of a life, quite literally, much less quality of life. And we got to think about what are those investments that are useful to our resilience. This is one of the main themes of the university and of the faculty that I'm in, BMS. How do we make investments to make ourselves resilient that don't defeat our own purpose and cut ourselves off at the knees? That would repeat the mistakes of the Soviet Union. We cannot do that. It looks like they're doubling down on the same mistakes that they made in the 1980s, and that is extremely sad for them. I feel sad for the country as a whole. Of course, I feel most for Ukraine. I feel most for the European Union. I hope that Ukraine is a member sometime soon. But that's a process all unto itself. And I think it's important that we show that solidarity. But that also for ourselves that we come up with a plan. Your question was, what can the academics do? Some can tell you about, there are different academics that can do different things. Some will tell you about military deterrence and alliance politics and cooperation. That's part of what I do, but as we saw from the introduction, that's not what I write about most of the time. Most of the time I write about economic strategy. And that was a critical part of why the West won at the end of the 1980s. The Russian economy and health system was collapsing. The Western economy was booming. It had its recessions, those things happen. But overall, economic and social improvement was progressing. And we need to find a way as academics to focus on economic policy and security and health, all of the things that we focus on here at the university, and how technology changes that as well. I talked about drone warfare and combat clouds. We need to find ways to make all of this happen. And we need to make our money stretch further. So if we're talking about e-health or organs on a chip, how do we take care of people better? How do we provide that technology for the services, but also for the companies that are here within Europe so that we have the productive capacity to make this work? That was the package of solutions, and you need people working on that who produce the research, advise government, do talks like this, even work with interest groups and business associations. And here's one of the things, is that, one last thing, because my focus is on Europe more than anything else. And for the very first time, the European Union has authorized the use of EU funds for defense purposes. And that was a direct result, that was 2019. It took them 5 years, but they finally came up with a response to the invasion of Crimea. And so you've got specialists who work on defense stuff, but it also needs to be discussed in the European Parliament. We have an organ of democratic legitimacy. How do we balance out our efforts to defend ourselves with our need to grow and to distribute that wealth and public services equitably? And that includes things like housing, which is not necessarily a public thing, but part of it is. We have a housing crisis here. We have an energy crisis at the same time. Those things have to be solved together, and you need to push politicians from the academia side as well as the NGO side to say, these two things could be solved together at the same time if you're smart about it, right? You need to import less gas, deal with energy efficiency better. That means that if you look around at housing here in the Netherlands or Germany, anywhere, you need to have better housing that's better insulated, produces its own energy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That all has to be built. And if there is a shortage of housing anyway, right, then you do that as well. Does that respond to your question? Or?
It was a real
Yeah, I tend to be very enthusiastic about these things and go on about them.
So as a university, we always look at societal challenges.
Yes.
And with this Ukraine war comes new societal challenges, so to say.
It activates and emphasizes societal challenges that were already there even more.
Yeah.
But yeah, the defense part is, the military part is the new aspect that really forces us to think about this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we have a couple of minutes left. Shawn, one of the things I was wondering, you're an EU specialist. To my opinion, the EU once started at the EG, the Europese Gemeenschap voor Kolen en Staal. I don't know what it's
European Community for Coal and Steel.
Yeah, and it was some kind of peace diplomacy club, so to say. But why isn't the EU negotiating in this conflict? Because usually they do, but now they're militarizing, they're completely absent. And Israel, Turkey, countries like that are doing the peace negotiations. Why is the EU so invisible on the diplomatic stage?
Because for Russia, the EU is the enemy.
Yes, that's what I feared already.
But it's not, but it's the enemy within a larger enemy. So Russia views the EU as the civilian wing of NATO. And that's why it needs to divide and conquer it. And when it comes to being able to negotiate effectively, we don't hold the true levers of power. The true levers of power are military means, but also finance and production. And the United States is our superior in all of those ways. So people do not go, if you look at finance, for example, yes, people look at the European Central Bank, but they look to the Federal Reserve if there's a crisis. If there's a military crisis, they don't look to Brussels, they look to Washington, D.C. as well. And if you were to think about the types of things that can be offered or threatened, the carrot and the stick, then it's really Washington who either provides, has the resources, has the structural power to do this in ways that Europe does not. It doesn't mean that Europe's unimportant, but it's within a context. And it's likely that Europe will take over more responsibility for its, but it will take time.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I see. Perhaps one final,
My question is about the map. When we look at it, then we see that there are the friendly country, which is Belarus, then there are the neighbors, which are the EU countries, but then there is Moldova, which part of is Transnistria, which is very friendly to Russian. Then my question is that, do you see the possibility, the war, a bit spreading to that side?
Yes.
That's a very decisive answer. Please, Shawn, could you explain why you're so convinced?
Whenever a country is, this is a repeated pattern of behavior on the part of Russia, which is to get a foothold in various countries and exploit that foothold to destabilize them. And they will continue to do so. I mean, if they're in a broader war here, there's no reason to believe that they wouldn't do it. It's like saying, I mean, there are other questions. If you're faced with a hypothetical, then you look at what they've done before, right? So one of the ones that we discussed was not just nuclear weapons, but chemical weapons. Would Russia do it? Absolutely. They've done it before so many times. And that's the reason why we know that they're able to do it. So would they exploit Transnistria the way they've exploited North Ossetia? Sure. And that is effectively a base. And it's not limited to that. There are places in the Western Balkans as well, which are potentially just as dangerous.
Serbia, or for example. Yeah.
No. Okay, we have one more question over here.
Yes, thanks. I'm really concerned about all the propaganda from the Putin regime that is going on, like that the West wants to destroy the Russian culture, and I'm wondering if this has a lot of support within the Russian people, and if it's likely that the Russian people or many would also support a direct confrontation with the West and to support a war because they think that the West wants to destroy them, their culture and everything? Or is it likely that maybe there will be also a riot against Putin?
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. I think that if you think about American politics over the last 6 years, that you probably have a good map of what to think about Russia. We don't really have a lot of direct data, right? So there's a bit of guesswork, but we can make a number of observations. One is that people have different opinions, right? That shouldn't surprise us, really. One thing that we did begin to appreciate after Putin took over power 20 years ago was that, more than 20 years ago, was that he had a certain solid, consistent basis of support because of how far people's lives had deteriorated under Yeltsin. Right? And that certain percentage of Russian society, it's quite believable that he has that support. When we think about support for a regime in the public, there are two aspects to it, which I'm first talking about, how much support is there overall. We don't know for sure. And we don't know and I think this is the most important thing, under what conditions might that change to a sort of tipping point, to try and dig behind your question a bit. I mean, I think it's safe to assume that there's, I don't know, let's just say a certain considerable percentage of the Russian population that supports what he's doing, and that probably always have done. True believers, right? Then you have folks who are maybe not true believers, but influenced by propaganda, as you say. And those two groups themselves might be enough to help keep his claim to the presidency comfortable. And then there is another group, which of course is being repressed, right? The ones who go out and then the bigger the first two groups are, the easier it is to simply send out your thugs to take care of the Democrats, the liberals, the people who want peace. There's that. And then the other side of the answer is that at the moment it doesn't really matter. Right? When you're dealing with an authoritarian state, it's difficult to matter. Because as long as the ultimate question is always this in an authoritarian, even totalitarian system, are they willing to shoot? If Putin tells the military to go and take care of these people, will they do it? So far, there's no expectation that they won't. And does this make a difference? Yeah. If you go to the area around 1990, 1991-ish, right? You have Russia, where the military does not, and you have China, 1988, Tiananmen Square, where they do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one stays authoritarian and has a much better grasp on its society, digital authoritarianism, plus all of the tools and tactics that totalitarian states use. And Russia started learning. Now, there's the last thing. Ultimately, hopefully, it should not matter. I mean, we're getting up to our time. So there are two things here. Russia had the chance under Putin to modernize the country, and he didn't. He modernized the military, that was the story, and in ways that still ostensibly matter, but not in all of the ways. And thankful for the fact that they did such a poor job of that. What you want a country to do, if it has been great and it has collapsed, is for it to rebuild things for the general welfare, rebuild the economy, rebuild state institutions, rebuild public health services and education, things that lift people up. This is what you want, and he hasn't done it. Whereas China, even if you disagree, as I think we should, about the political priorities and ways of the way that that system has worked, has built its economy, built up its industry, built up its higher education, its public health services, so that when COVID hits, they can handle it and Russia can't. 1 million people died last year in Russia. In a country of 140 million people with an economy the size of Italy's in the biggest biggest country on the planet.
Yes.
My God,
Incredible.
how incompetent must you be? And yeah, I mean, this is what we want. So, sorry, this is not what we want. We don't want them to collapse. We want them to join us. We want them to look at Ukraine and say, wow, if they can do it, we can do it too. And as we're getting towards the closing, but and what we have to hope for is that at some point, whoever is leading Russia will make the changes to make that happen. Because there's a reason why Ukraine wants to join the EU, just like a bunch of other countries. There's a reason why individuals want to move here, because we may not be perfect, but we're doing something right. And it was a peace project. European Coal and Steel Community was about economic modernization, but also ensuring that we did that together in ways that the technology, the industrial capacity, were done in such a way that everybody could see and monitor and feel secure with the fact that this was done for peaceful purposes, that this was lifting us up. Whatever kind of solution we have to the war will be only one step to finding some way eventually, if the door is open, and we don't know that it will be open, to a Russia that accepts that this is a wonderful thing for Ukraine to do, and that maybe in the near future, even if they don't want to join, that they will have more friendly relations with us, and not look at us the wrong way. That's it.
Shawn, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you everybody for being here.
Yes, I was really impressed. I don't know if you have any. I don't think we have time for more
No, I
questions.
completely agree.
People can come afterwards to you to ask you. But I think you did a splendid job in explaining the complexity of this whole situation, explaining the role of the EU, the NATO. So, thank you very much. I'm on a big hand for Shawn Donnelly. Thanks.
Thank you.